Imagine a world where the maps are written in ink that can't be erased. A world where every border is a fact and every nation has a seat at the table of history. Now imagine walking into that world, presenting your identity, and being told that you and everything you represent simply do not exist. It was July 1954. Tokyo's Haneda International Airport was a place of transformation. The scars of World War II were still healing, and Japan was reaching out to the world, its runways humming with the arrival of Douglas DC-6s and Lockheed Constellations. On one particularly sweltering afternoon, a routine flight from Europe touched down, taxiing through the shimmering heat haze of the tarmac. Among the passengers was a man who looked like the very definition of 1950s professional success. He was a middle-aged Caucasian man with a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray wool suit. He didn't look like a man of mystery. He looked like a man with a schedule. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had navigated international terminals 1,000 times before. He stepped up to the immigration counter. He spoke French as his primary language, but when the Japanese officials addressed him, he responded in fluent, polite Japanese. There was no reason for alarm, no reason for the officer behind the desk to hesitate, until he opened the man's passport. The document felt right in the officer's hands. The leather was worn, the paper had the correct weight, and the stamps were numerous. But as the officer scanned the cover, his eyes locked onto a word that made the air in the room feel suddenly very cold. The country of origin was listed as the United Kingdom of Taured. The officer looked up, then back at the book. He called his supervisor. Soon a small circle of officials had gathered around the small wooden desk, whispering in hushed, urgent tones. They reached for their official handbooks, their atlases, their lists of sovereign states recognized by the newly formed United Nations. They searched for Taured. They found nothing. The man, however, seemed more annoyed than frightened. He checked his watch, sighing with the impatience of a businessman who was going to be late for a meeting. When they finally took him to a private interrogation room, he explained with calm, growing frustration that Taured was located in Europe. Specifically, it was nestled in the Pyrenees Mountains, between France and Spain. He told them Taured had existed for over 1,000 years. He spoke of its history, its culture, its pride. But when the officials finally laid out a world map and asked him to point to his home, the man's hand began to shake. He pointed directly to the Principality of Andorra. But when he saw the name Andorra printed on the map, his face didn't just show confusion. It showed a deep existential horror. He had never heard of Andorra. He insisted that the map was wrong, that it was some kind of elaborate practical joke. To him, the world had literally shifted under his feet. The Japanese authorities were at a loss. Was this a master forger, a spy with a brilliantly constructed yet bizarre cover story? Or was he something that defied the laws of physics? To prove his identity, the stranger opened his briefcase. Inside was a collection of documents that should have settled the matter, but instead they only deepened the nightmare. He had a driver's license issued by the government of Taured. He had a checkbook from a bank in Taured. He even had a wallet filled with a mixture of European currencies, French francs, German marks, and coins that bore the symbols and language of a kingdom no one in that room had ever seen. The officials began to work the phones. They called the Tokyo company the man claimed to be visiting for a business meeting. The company existed, but their representatives were adamant. They had never heard of this man, and they certainly had no meeting scheduled with anyone from a place called Taured. They called the hotel where he claimed to have a long-standing reservation. The hotel confirmed they had rooms available, but there was no record of his name in their books. As the sun began to set over Tokyo, the decision was made to hold the man for further investigation. He was not under arrest in the criminal sense, but he was an enigma that could not be released into the city. They took him to a local hotel, often cited as the prestigious Hotel New Otani, and placed him in a room on the 15th floor. To ensure he didn't slip away, 2 armed immigration guards were stationed directly outside his door. The room had no balcony. The windows were modern, high-altitude glass, sealed shut with no way to open them from the inside. There was only one way in and one way out, through the door, guarded by two men who never took their eyes off the handle. All night, the hallway was silent. The guards reported no sounds from within, no footsteps, no running water, no voices. When the sun rose the next morning, the officials returned to resume their questioning. They knocked. No answer. They used a master key to turn the lock. The room was perfect. The bed had been slept in, the sheets slightly rumpled. But the man was gone. His leather briefcase, his strange coins, his Tauridian passport, every trace of his presence had vanished. The guards were horrified. They swore on their lives that the door had never opened. The windows were still locked tight, unbroken, looking out over a 15-story drop. There was no crawl space, no hidden exits. The man from Taured had simply ceased to be. He had stepped out of a routine flight and into our history, only to dissolve back into the silence from which he came. For decades, this story circulated in paranormal circles as the ultimate proof of the multiverse. It was a glitch in the matrix before that term even existed. But as the 21st century arrived, digital archaeologists began to dig into the archives of 1950s Tokyo. And what they found was a story perhaps even more fascinating than the legend itself. The year wasn't 1954, it was 1959, and the man wasn't a traveler from another dimension. He was a man named John Allen Kuchar Zegras. Zegras was a ghost of a different kind. He didn't vanish from a hotel room. He was a master of the long con, a man who had successfully navigated the post-war world using nothing but audacity and a homemade identity. In October 1959, Zegras arrived in Tokyo from Taipei, accompanied by his Korean wife. He didn't get caught at the airport. In fact, he was so good at his craft that he spent months living in Japan before the authorities even noticed he existed. Zegras's downfall came not from a map, but from money. He was arrested in early 1960 for cashing fraudulent checks at the Tokyo branch of Chase Manhattan Bank. When the police began to look into his background, they realized they were dealing with a man whose entire life was a work of fiction. The passport Zegras carried was, in fact, the blueprint for the Taured legend. It wasn't issued by Taured, but by a place he called the United Kingdom of Taured. He claimed Taured was a sovereign state in Africa, located south of the Sahara with a population of 2 million. He described himself as a naturalized Ethiopian and a secret agent for Colonel Nasser of Egypt. The passport itself was a masterpiece of absurdity. Reports from the time described it as being the size of a weekly magazine. It was covered in mysterious symbols and a language that no linguist could identify. Beneath the official-looking seal of Taured was a proclamation that Zegras would use to silence any doubters. Urchubwai Oktra Nagusi Habesi Trop Tarapa. Linguists and philologists were baffled. It wasn't French, it wasn't Arabic, it wasn't any dialect known to man. It was a language born entirely in the mind of John Zegras. And yet, this man had used this magazine-sized fake passport to travel across the Middle East, through Southeast Asia, and finally into the heart of Japan. He had fooled embassies, airlines, and border guards for years. When the case of the mystery man finally reached the Tokyo District Court in August 1960, the atmosphere was electric. The press was obsessed with him. Who was this man who spoke 14 languages? Who was this pilot who claimed to have flown for the Royal Air Force and been captured by the Germans? The lead investigator, a man named Atsuyuki Sasa, would later recount the interrogation in his memoirs. Zegras didn't just claim to be from a fake country. He claimed to be a pawn in a global game of chess. He told the court he was in Japan on a secret mission to recruit Japanese military volunteers for the United Arab Republic. He claimed he worked for the FBI. He claimed he worked for the CIA, but the Japanese judges were not interested in global conspiracies. They were interested in the 200,000 yen he had stolen through forged checks. On August 10, 1960, the judge began to read the verdict, 1 year in prison. As the interpreter finished translating the sentence, John Zegras didn't hang his head in shame. Instead, he did something that would haunt the spectators for the rest of their lives. He suddenly stood up. From his mouth, he pulled a shard of broken glass he had hidden there throughout the entire hearing. Before the guards could reach him, he slashed his own arms, screaming in English that he would rather die than be a prisoner of a world that refused to recognize his truth. Blood sprayed across the courtroom floor. The guards wrestled him down as he shouted, "I am going to kill myself." He was rushed to Kyobashi Hospital, his injuries severe but not fatal. This moment of raw, bloody defiance is where the legend of the vanishing man likely began to mutate. The man who disappeared into the hospital was soon transformed in the public imagination into the man who vanished from a hotel room. The legal aftermath was just as strange. Zegras filed an appeal, and in a shocking turn of events, the Tokyo High Court overturned his conviction in 1961. Not because he was innocent, but because the judge had committed a technical error. He hadn't finished reading the reasons for the judgment before the suicide attempt caused the court to be cleared. Zegras was eventually resentenced, but by the time the legal dust settled, he had already served his time in detention. On a cold December day in 1961, John Zegras walked out of a Japanese courtroom a free man. He looked at the cameras, thanked the court, and said, "From now on, I will enter a new life in a new country." He was deported to Hong Kong, and then he vanished. No records of him exist after that moment. He didn't return to Taured or even the United States. He simply evaporated into the teeming crowds of the 1960s, leaving behind a riddle that we are still trying to solve. So, how does a con man from 1960 become a dimension traveler from 1954? This is where the story becomes a lesson in how urban legends are built. In 1964, a French writer named Jacques Bergier mentioned the case in a book, but he changed the date to 1954 and added the interdimensional flavor. In 1981, another book called The Directory of Possibilities locked in the name Taured and the detail about the man pointing to Andorra. The human mind hates a void. We hate the idea that a man could simply be a brilliant liar who fooled the world. We would rather believe in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. We would rather believe that every time we make a choice, the universe splits, and that somewhere the United Kingdom of Taured is real. And John Zegras wasn't the only one. In 1851, a man named Joffer Voren was found wandering in a small German village. He didn't speak German well. He said he was from a country called Laxaria, on a continent called Sacria. He described his world's geography with terrifying precision, naming continents like Aflar and Uplar, places that don't exist in our atlases. Like the man from Taured, Voren was being escorted to Berlin for study when he allegedly leaped from a carriage and disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. Then there was Jerome of Sandy Cove in 1863, a man found on a Canadian beach with his legs amputated who never spoke a word for 50 years. These people from nowhere act as mirrors for our own insecurities. They represent the terrifying possibility that our reality isn't as solid as we think it is. Is it possible that John Zegras wasn't a fraud? Is it possible he was a man from a parallel world who realized he was trapped in ours and used his brilliant mind to forge a path back? Or was he simply a man who understood that if you dress well enough, speak enough languages, and act with enough authority, the world will believe almost anything? We will never know the truth of John Zegras. He remains the mystery man of Haneda, a figure standing at the intersection of history and myth. The next time you're walking through an airport, look at the faces in the crowd. Look at the man in the sharp suit, the woman with the old-fashioned luggage. We all carry passports that say where we're from. But in the quiet moments between the ticking of the terminal clock, you have to wonder, if the map changed tomorrow, would anyone believe that you were real? Or would you too become a legend, a ghost in the terminal, forever waiting for a flight back to a home that no longer exists? Thank you for traveling with us into the heart of the Taured mystery. If you found this journey through the cracks of reality compelling, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more files to open and many more ghosts to chase. Until next time, watch the borders. The world is thinner than you think.